Presentation going. All right. Does that look good to everyone? Okay. So, yeah, we are going to cover the Homeless Management Information System, as we all know and love, HMIS today. It is a little intimidating to do this presentation with Chris being here for any portion of it. But I know he has reviewed it, so we're good to go. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. When I put this together, I was trying to think about this from the point of view of an ESG recipient, specifically a state one, which I have worked for before. And I was thinking, you know, depending on where you are and the size of your implementation and how many COCs and all that, the interaction with HMIS can be more or less limited depending on, you know, what all that looks like. So I kind of just put this together as here's what HMIS is, here's what goes into it, and here's what it means to you. So that's kind of the content we'll go through. And then there should be room at the end for discussion if you want to get into anything a little more detail. We don't have poll questions in this one because there is plenty of interaction next week in the clinic session. So, you know, we're going to follow our typical format here. So if you want to drop something in the chat that you would hope to learn about HMIS and ESG and how they interact, please feel free to do so. And then we can consider that for the conversation later. And this is kind of what we hope to learn. So what are the requirements for ESG recipients and subrecipients? How do the standards apply to subrecipient projects? And then how HMIS and data standards affect ESG reporting for you at the recipient level. So we're going to go through all of that. We'll do an overview, requirements for ESG, data collection, and why all of it matters. So the definition of the Homeless Management Information System is that it is a locally administered electronic data collection system that stores longitudinal person-level information about people who access the homeless response system. Every continuum of care is responsible for managing an HMIS using software that complies with HUD's requirements. Those requirements are the 2004 data and technical standards. Those are the ones that we have just reverted to. There was an interim rule that you may or may not have seen that HUD had out there in the world for a while there that had some additional things that was intended, I think, to move forward at some point, but that interim rule is dead now. And so we have gone back to the 2004 data and technical standards. There are more up-to-date things on the HUD exchange that you can reference, but when it comes to the compliance things, like what it means to actually have an HMIS and run one from a COC's perspective, this is what you would reference.
And I'm just going to butt in for 1 second, Mike.
Sure.
So we have the technical standards from 2004, but the data standards change every 2 years. Yep. So I just wanted to let folks know that we've actually started the process to start the 2024 data standards already with HUD. I am the ESG data SME. So that means I write the ESG manual and I advise HUD on what they should do. We're not looking at big changes for ESG. We've managed ESG, we've managed $4 billion of ESG to CV to come into HMIS without big changes. We're not going to see big changes. So I just wanted to kind of say that. Don't look for big HMIS changes moving forward from us.
Yep, thank you. And then of note, it's not just ESG that uses HMIS, it is many federal programs that work with homelessness. So we're talking about, of course, the Continuum of Care program. We're talking about the RIE program. So Runaway and Homeless Youth is the acronym there, PATH, and then Supportive Services for Veteran Families. All of those are required to use HMIS in one capacity or another. When it comes to how the HMIS system is implemented in a continuum of care, this is what that looks like. So I just kind of put together a chart here to show you the continuum of care and or its governance structure, depending on how they are set up. They are kind of the top level for their geographic area. The continuum of care has to appoint an HMIS lead. And then also has to choose an HMIS vendor. And the HMIS lead is often, you know, very involved in that process of choosing the vendor. And then underneath the lead, you have participating organizations. This is where your funded organizations come into the picture. Since they use HMIS in the continuum of care where they're located, they are considered participating organizations. And then each of those organizations has end users. So those are the people who are actually logging into the system, putting data in for clients, and are really responsible for what the data looks like in the system. So just be aware that COC governance structures differ, and the governing board for the COC may or may not be directly involved in HMIS issues. It depends on what their structure is. Sometimes there's a committee that's more involved. Sometimes there's a work group that's more involved. So it's a continuum of care responsibility, but the way that that looks locally can vary from place to place. So these are the overall responsibilities for the continuum of care, or its governance structure, or whatever they have put in place based on what I just said. It has to designate a single HMIS for the geographic area. And then underneath that, you see it has to designate an eligible applicant to manage the HMIS. And then managing the HMIS means review, revise, and approve a privacy plan, security plan, and data quality plan. It's not uncommon for the HMIS lead to be heavily involved in creating that plan, but the COC has to approve the plan. And then ensuring consistent participation of recipients and subrecipients. The continuum of care has to make sure that all agencies that need to be participating in HMIS in their geographic area are participating. The COC ensures that the HMIS is administered in compliance with requirements, and that's done in collaboration with the HMIS lead. The continuum of care also has to monitor the HMIS lead, so that's a HUD requirement. The responsibilities of the HMIS lead are shown here. So the HMIS lead generally looks over the day-to-day functions of operating the system. So that includes training, help desk responses, technical support, things like that. As I mentioned, they may be pretty heavily involved in developing the data quality plan, the privacy plan, and security plan, which would ultimately be approved by the continuum of care. And then underneath that, your HMIS lead typically also monitors compliance with applicable HMIS standards within the continuum of care, and administers HMIS vendor contracts and agreements. So the HMIS lead is usually the one that negotiates contracts with the software provider and handles that whole process. The lead also executes HMIS participation and end user agreements with participating organizations. So when an organization is going to access the system, the HMIS lead usually oversees that process with some interaction on the continuum of, or with the continuum of care. So, collaborating with and monitoring the HMIS vendor is another thing that falls under the HMIS lead. They have to make sure that the vendor is living up to what they said they would do in their contracts that they have negotiated. This is another thing where it's important to note. I want to make the point because we're going to be saying later that ESG jurisdictions should be collaborating with COCs and HMIS leads. It's just important to once again note that can look different depending on the COC. So you might interact with a committee in one place, the COC board in another place, collaborative applicant in another place. It just depends on how they have set things up. Oh. All right, went backwards there. So the HMIS vendor. So without an HMIS software, there is no HMIS, right? You have to have the software. That's how the system works. And so you have to have a vendor to provide that software. There's a number of vendors out there. The vendor should have clear and established expectations with the HMIS lead, and those should be laid out in contracts and or agreements. They should ensure clarity on HUD and federal partner expectations and provide technical support and assistance. This is probably a gross oversimplification of all of that because it does get very in-depth and detailed with how it is actually implemented, but those are overall responsibilities of a vendor, and those are things the HMIS lead should be making sure the vendor is living up to. And then the vendor also develops and manages the HMIS software. So like I said, there's a variety of them out there. They look different, they feel different, and they work different. But it's up to the vendor to maintain all of that. And it's done in collaboration with the HMIS lead. And then you have your participating organizations. So they are where your end users are housed. And so they are the ones that are collecting data and entering it into the system. They should be responsible for data quality monitoring. We're going to talk about data quality as we get into the presentation later. But they have to provide quality data for community planning processes, and we're going to get into that later. And then participate in the point in time count, the housing inventory count, and a number of other reporting efforts that go through HMIS. Privacy and security compliance. So that's a really important one. When the HMIS lead has a participating organization and its users sign agreements to use the system, there are privacy provisions there, or at least there should be. And they have to live up to what they have agreed to. And that also includes participating in meetings and work groups. There's often training around stuff like that. These organizations should participate in those. And then HMIS policy and procedure compliance. So collaborate with the HMIS lead and other participating organizations to make sure that the participant organizations are consistently following all of the policies that the COC and the HMIS lead have put in place for the local implementation. I just said a lot. Basically, what it is getting to is that the continuum of care and the HMIS lead are going to establish requirements and policies consistent with federal guidance and local expectations. And the participating organizations have to make sure they're following all of that. And there should be a monitoring process to make sure that's happening. And then types of data elements. So these are the things that go into HMIS, the actual types of data that are being collected. There's a lot more detail to it. This is just the overarching types, but there's project descriptor data elements. So those are the ones that describe the project, and there are specific ones that are prescribed for ESG projects. So that's a setup issue in the system. There are universal data elements. So those are the ones that are collected for all projects. And it's usually, we're going to talk about what they are, but it's your basic stuff. It's, name, social security number, things like that. Program-specific data elements are the ones that are not collected across the board, but they are collected for specific programs. And there are some common ones that we will show you later. And then you have metadata elements. Those are the ones that are generated by the system. HUD requires certain things to be automatically generated for client records. So to facilitate reporting and things like that. So those are your metadata elements. So we're going to go through all of this stuff in a little more detail as we get through this. I'm going to turn it over to Gordon to talk about HMIS and ESG.
My favorite. I am also an HMIS nerd. You're beset by HMIS nerds, so I'm excited to get into it. Slide, please. So at a very high level, these are your area-wide systems coordination requirements for the ESG program. ESG recipients are required to ensure that data on every person experiencing homelessness who is served and all the activities that are assisted under ESG are entered into the relevant HMIS in the area for which those people are located. What that means is ultimately you as the ESG recipient are responsible for making sure that your subs and your sub-subs are entering participant data into the HMIS for their relevant COCs, of which you have many. For ESG, victim service providers, or VSPs, and we're talking about domestic violence service providers, are prohibited from entering data into the HMIS. They're instead required to use an HMIS comparable database that meets the exact same standards as any other HMIS database, and that does so in a way that protects the safety and privacy of domestic violence survivors. I made sure to put this note in here that this applies at the provider level and not the project level. And the distinction that we're drawing here is that intuitively, you might think this project serves primarily people who are survivors of domestic violence. So that's got to go into an HMIS comparable database. That's not the way that it works. The requirement applies at the service provider level. And so a victim services provider is fundamentally defined as an organization, a private nonprofit whose primary mission is to provide services to victims of DV. And that's a pretty broad umbrella. And so any project operated by that service provider regardless of whether it serves exclusively people who are fleeing domestic violence, broad umbrella, or partially, or even not at all, has to go into a comparable database. Conversely, projects that are operated by organizations that are not victim services providers must go into the standard HMIS, irrespective of whether they serve some, all, or no victims of domestic violence. So the prohibition ultimately, or rather the HMIS versus HMIS comparable database thing applies at the agency level. It does not apply at the project level. Legal services providers who can document that they're entering client level data that would violate attorney-client privilege are also permitted to use a comparable database. Otherwise, they're required to use HMIS. And they're still on the hook for collecting all of the relevant data for ESG. Next slide, please.
I'm just going to punt in there for 1 second, Gordon. So that legal services thing that Gordon just said doesn't come up very often. So you shouldn't see it too often in California. I've only seen it in a few communities. And HUD made some determinations around ESGCV that we really should have legal services set up as where they're serving. So if they're serving clients in emergency shelter, they're serving clients in rapid rehousing, which has made data collection a little bit clearer because we have that information in HMIS already, and we're just providing the legal services. So it's a little cleaner today than it had been in the past. Sorry, Gordon.
No, not at all. The legal services provider thing, I've never bumped into it. Every legal services provider that I've ever worked with has wanted to use HMIS because HMIS comparable databases, as we're going to talk about here, are just a significantly higher burden of frustration for a whole lot of not a lot of gain, unless you really need to. So an HMIS comparable database is, again, it's a database that meets all of HMIS's data standards in a way that protects the safety and privacy of DV survivors, or in the case of legal services providers, attorney-client privilege. It organizes data in ways that define relationships for easy access and reporting. And this next bullet point is the real sticker. It has to be able to collect all of the data elements required for an HMIS project type, and they have to allow users to enter specific data at multiple stages to support the reporting and performance measurements required by HUD. What that means is effectively an HMIS comparable database has to be able to do exactly the same things that an HMIS database does, in addition to which it needs to be able to provide the safety and privacy provisions that the Violence Against Women Act requires that it does. The other sort of distinction that I would draw there is that there isn't HMIS software and HMIS comparable software. They're not necessarily separate, although there are software providers that build themselves as HMIS comparable software providers, and those that build themselves as HMIS only providers. There's not necessarily a distinction between those two softwares. It's ultimately, does this meet the requirement? Does this meet the HUD data collection requirements? Does this meet the HUD reporting requirements? And for HMIS comparables, does this meet the safety and privacy requirements? Mike, I see you popping in there.
Yeah, I'm just gonna it's probably just aligning with what you said, but I will agree. And the thing is, there is an inherent conflict between what an HMIS is supposed to do and the privacy provisions with VAWA. And so whether or not a comparable database is compliant with the privacy stuff, honestly, in my experience, it depends on who you ask. I haven't seen a single instance where one was agreed upon by everyone that it was compliant with everything. So as a recipient, I think the main concern for HCD, if an agency is using a comparable database, is can it produce the reports that you need? Can you get your caper from it? That's what I would be primarily concerned with.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the only thing that I would add to that, and this is a gigantic can of worms that I am going to really encourage you not to open today, but it is worth noting that, and we're on a private contract, I can say this, that you got to look really carefully at these, I mean, really any HMIS, but at HMIS comparable databases especially. There is not one universally agreed upon solution And that is in part because all of the ones that currently exist, there's hinkiness around, like, do they fully comply with the data collection? Can they actually produce comparable reporting? And so, you know, that it's a tempest in a tea kettle that you probably haven't opened. But in the sort of DB and comparable database world, there's a lot of discussion happening right now, especially with HUD involved, among others, around, like, is there one that meets all of the standards? Are there multiple? In what ways do they meet those standards? What do we do if there isn't? And so on and so on and so on. So just to say that there is a can of worms there, and go carefully before cracking it open. Next slide, please. So considerations for y'all. One thing to note is that your geography overlaps with other ESG jurisdictions. And so you're going to have multiple ESG recipients forcing down HMIS requirements onto COCs that fall within multiple jurisdictions. At the COC level, HMIS lead agencies need to work with both HCD and HCD subrecipients to understand the funding components behind the funding that each of those organizations are receiving, to ensure that their projects are set up correctly. So in other words, it really falls on the HMIS lead to make sure, to some extent, that if HCD is funding a subrecipient to do XYZ, that XYZ projects are set up correctly. You've got a shelter, you're funded for shelter, so you've got a shelter project. You're funded for rapid, so you've got a rapid project, and so on. Next slide, please. We're highlighting this, and this is like the other slide in here that I feel very strongly about, because I think it's important for y'all to hear. Under the HMIS component of ESG, generally speaking, we think about that as an add-on, right? So you grant somebody funds for rapid, and then you give them a little ESG HMIS money so they can actually enter data. But it can also fund the costs of setting up and maintaining an HMIS, both the costs of doing so and the costs of an HMIS lead administering that system. This can be an incredibly powerful incentive to create multi-COC or even statewide HMIS implementations, which is like, that's not a today thing. But there is a gigantic benefit to you to incentivizing the creation of HMIS systems that, instead of being fractured across multiple COCs, are instead shared to some extent across multiple COCs. It reduces HMIS cost, right? We have 36 HMIS implementations. It reduces the knowledge burden on HCD. It reduces the reporting burden. It increases information sharing between COCs. It reduces the costs of maintaining multiple different HMIS implementations. Consolidating HMIS implementations is so good, and ESG can fund that. It's food for thought for later. Next slide, please. So all ESG projects need to be set up in HMIS under one of the following components: street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, or rapid rehousing. Those are your participant-facing components. Obviously, you don't have an admin component. That's an add-on. HMIS is complicated, but we're going to kind of blow past that right now. But broadly speaking, we're talking about these 4 participant-facing components. I see the question in the chat, and I promise that we will circle back briefly. Next slide, please. When we're talking about projects funded by multiple ESG jurisdictions, it gets a little sticky. Each project component handles it a little bit differently in terms of whether you have to set up 1 project, 2 projects, or whether you can kind of do both. Shelter does not need to separate clients into separate projects. There's no need to distinguish between which clients were served with which jurisdiction's money, and HUD, from their perspective, understand that this can cause clients to be counted in multiple capers. It's fine. And there's a significant advantage to having 1 project, even for 1 project for a shelter, even if it's got ESG from multiple jurisdictions. It reduces data entry complexity, it reduces data entry time, it reduces the administrative burden on the program. For street outreach, rapid, and homelessness prevention, you should separate clients for each jurisdiction. It's not required, but the HUD guidance is that you should do that, because you need to be able to produce a valid CAPR for each jurisdiction, which does separate clients out by jurisdiction. And if you've got multiple clients and multiple funding sources run through the same project, untangling that come CAPR time is a gigantic nightmare. I've seen it. I've lived it. I recommend not living it on your end. Absolutely. Next slide, please. Does Blue mean back over to you?
I think Chris was going to jump in on this one.
Is
But
Blue Chris? That's
I also
awesome.
think he's busily working on the chat.
I am busy working on the chat, but I will jump in here. So I think everyone knows this, but I have been working on a project with our HMIS leadership, our HMIS leads across the state, and with Stephanie, to gather a bunch of information so that we can begin our performance outcome data reporting for ESGCV. I've had conversations with Janice and Stephanie and Connie. At a minimum, there are probably more of you there that I cannot remember, that we are going to begin looking at how we can do HDIS reporting for the annual ESG program as required by the California state auditors. So to do that, one of the most important things that we need to begin to do is to make sure that all of our ESG contract numbers are in the HMIS. So I just finished the project today, capturing all ESGCV projects. Santa Barbara was my last one. I got it this morning. I have those, and the HMIS folks have put that information in their data system. So now when we pull data from HDIS, we can say, okay, this is the ESGCV state funded stuff. We're going to have to do the same project on a very different level, very smaller level for annual ESG. So I know Jeanette was giving me contract numbers just today for some other communities. San Bernardino apparently has not put any ESGCV data into HMIS yet. We're going to correct that to get a few more things done. But creating that universe will allow us to pull data from HDIS and analyze our program. And that's what the auditors have asked us to do, not just count widgets, but to be able to show the impact of these projects. So I just want to lay that out. We don't have to get too deep into it today, but I just want folks to be aware. Back to you all. And I have to depart, sorry.
All right. So project descriptor data elements. This is identifying, this is organization information, project information, COC information, funding sources, embed and unit inventory. This is fundamentally the sort of high level, what we would call metadata about the project, that tells you what the project is, who it's with, what it's for, and so on and so on. Project level information includes like project ID and name, its start and end dates, whether it's a continuum of care project, which is a yes for ESG, the project type. For continuum of care information, it includes which COC it's in, but also which geocode within the COC, which is a way of sort of regionalizing it. And the funding source will indicate the ESG component for the project. So is it rapid? Is it street outreach, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide.
All right.
Talking more about that, over to Mike.
Yep. So now we're going to talk about what actually goes into the system. So what are the data points and what does that mean for you? So just important points to start off with. All ESG funded projects are required to collect all of the universal data elements, which we'll show you what those are, all of the program specific data elements for the applicable project type that they are administering. We're not going to show you every one of the program specific data elements, but we'll give you an idea of what those look like. And then any special or custom data elements required by the continuum of care or the funders. So, you know, if a continuum of care, for instance, had developed a specific assessment in their system that they wanted clients to go through, that would be collected as well as a local requirement. So the universal data elements are what you see on your screen here. I'm not going to, read through every one of them. You'll have these slides, but but it's your basic identifying information and information that's useful across all of the program types. And it's also things like your project start date, exit date, destination. Those are things that have a big impact on reporting, especially with HUD reports. We did want to note here that race is a known issue for data collection when serving members of tribal nations because they don't always identify with the options provided. Chris mentioned earlier that every 2 years, the data standards are updated by HUD. So I'm sorry, I can't remember if it's the data or technical standards. It is the manual that tells the vendor what has to be in the system. So HUD tells the vendor which specific options have to exist for things like race in the system. And so they're kind of limited on, they have to put what HUD says to put there, but members of tribal nations don't always identify with those specific options. So we just want to point out that that is a known issue in the system, or in all of the HMIS systems, I guess I should say. These are some common program-specific data elements. So again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but you can see it's additional elements that are informative for specific program types. And some of them are very common across program types. So like take income and sources, for instance. That's one that you see across most HUD funding sources. We wanted to touch for a second on a couple of different ways that shelters can be set up in the system. So when you fund an emergency shelter project, that can be set up as what is known by entry exit, which is when a person's record is created when they enter and they are in the program. And then when they exit, the exit assessment is done. It can also be set up as night by night, which requires people to check in and out of the shelter, and it requires some additional data elements. Night by night is more cumbersome. That is really what we want to point out here. So there are instances when it can be appropriate with high volume shelters to do it as night by night, but honestly, in my opinion, I have not seen any of those instances. I think entry exit, if you can at all do it, is by far the option to choose, and wouldn't be sad if the night by night option went away, honestly, because it is very difficult and it lends itself to poor data quality. And that's what we want to point out here. If one of your emergency shelter funded projects were being set up as night by night, I think you'd want to understand why and understand if that is how it has to be set up or if it could be entry exit, simply because it could cause some issues with your CAPER reports and the data quality. What you see here, if you look at the chart, is the additional elements required for night by night of current living situation, date of engagement, and bed night date. I'm going to focus on living situation and date of engagement to make the point here, but those are notoriously difficult elements to get good data for. Shelters are hard to get good data for in general. And what I will also, so I'm going to bring in another project type for a second, but current living situation and date of engagement are also used in street outreach projects, and they are notoriously hard to document elements in that project type. So it's kind of like you took two hard to document elements from one project type and put it into another project type that's already hard to get good data for. And it just makes it very, very difficult. So when we talk about current living situation, the reason that is hard to do is because the expectation there is that a shelter records every contact made with the client. And the contact is defined as an interaction between a worker and a client designed to engage the client. So like if they're just showing up to the shelter and they check in with the person at the front, that's not a contact. But if a caseworker talks to them, if someone provides them a service of any kind, all of that is required to be reported under that data element. And then when we think of date of engagement, that is considered to be the date when an interactive relationship resulted in a deliberate client assessment or beginning of a case plan. So, a person can be in and out of a shelter over and over and might not have a date of engagement because they're not actively working on a case plan towards permanent housing. But the day that begins should be recorded in the system as the date of engagement. As you can imagine, that it is hard to determine that exact date. And the people who are actually on the ground doing the work often are not as concerned. Like they're people. They want to work with their clients. They're not as much worried about the technical aspect of that data element. And that just lends itself to poor data quality. So if a shelter is set up by entry exit, you avoid all of the issues I just went through. Main point there, it's really difficult to collect data with the night by night setup. I'm not going to go through these because we really just talked through it, but you'll have these on the slides when we give them to you. It just lays out, kind of the differences in data collection between entry, exit, and night by night. Again, the point I'm making here is I would not advocate for the night by night setup unless it's absolutely necessary for a particular shelter for some reason. So for data quality requirements by entity, I just talked a lot about data quality. That's because it's really important. When we think about the different entities involved with HMIS, these are their responsibilities in general as it relates to data quality. So the continuum of care, as we said before, has to review, revise, and approve a data quality plan for their geography. So the continuum of care should have some sort of standards around data quality. And they have to ensure that continuum of care and ESG program participants consistently use the system. That's part of data quality too. The agencies have to consistently use the system. They if they're in and out, if they only have their case manager doing data entry 1 day a month, you're going to have poor quality data. They need to use the system consistently. For HCD, we'd be thinking about ensuring that subrecipients understand the importance of HMIS. So that's something that, we reference policies all the time. Your policies can sort of get at that, just making sure that the importance of HMIS is known and understood. And then consider if there are any additional data quality requirements you would impose beyond what the continua of care do. It is possible to do that. And then for the ESG subrecipients, you would expect them to comply with everything we just said. So any applicable data quality standards, including those that you set out as the state ESG recipient, and including any local ones for the continuum of care. What we are really getting at with all of the data quality talk is this. Data in HMIS needs to be accurate, complete, and timely. When data is not accurate, complete, and timely, it leads to ineffective data analysis. COCs they don't get a full picture of what's going on in their geography. You don't get a full picture of what happened with your funding from the CAPER reports. And it ultimately leads to bad decision-making for COCs, for ESG recipients, for anyone who uses that data. So that's why we harp on data quality so much. And so just a few more points on the role that HCD can play in data quality. You can use written standards for ESG to tie data quality standards to the local COC's plans. So what we're saying there is your ESG written standards can specifically say, if you are a subrecipient that receives our funding, you are required to follow the local continuum of care data quality plan. It's a simple thing to put that in your written standards, but what it does is provide some formality. It ties them to that data quality plan. You could also define data quality requirements through your contracts. So very similar to putting it in the written standards, you can have it as a contractual item that there is some sort of data quality requirement, and that could also be something that ties the subrecipients back to the local data quality plan. And you can also evaluate data quality through the monitoring process. So, when you go to monitor as part of your regular process, you can have them pull a data quality report and show you that they have decent data and have some sort of threshold. And if it doesn't meet that threshold, you can hold them accountable to that. And now back to Gordon.
It's funny because I've been sitting here trying hard to listen with my ESG recipient years on. And I literally just hit the point where I was like, we really need to contextualize this for like why CAHCD might care. Happily, we are now to the point where we get to discuss that. Next problem, please. Next slide, please. You can see where my head is today. So why does data matter? For COCs, they care about it for their system performance measures, which are their general overall annual report of how they're doing. Their LSA, which is similar, but it's a congressional report. the point in time count, which is their annual assessment of how many people are experiencing homelessness in the area and in what ways, their housing inventory chart, which is their annual assessment of how many beds they've got at any given time and year round, their annual performance reports, which is their project level annual assessment for coordinated entry, especially assessment of the performance of coordinated entry, and ultimately to create data-driven decisions. And I'm going to harp on that for just a second. There are really only two ways to make decisions, really only three ways to make decisions in terms of homeless policy, homeless assistance policy at a systems level. You could make it based on political considerations. You can make it based on your intuitive understanding of the situation, so you can guess, basically, or you can use data to inform or drive that decision-making process. And time and again, what we've seen in community after community is that decisions that are driven by data have good outcomes, have better outcomes, as long as the quality of the data is good. If you don't have good data, your data-driven decision is not good. In fact, it can produce really the opposite result that you're looking for. The way you get to good decisions is by having good data. The way you have good data is by being up on it here. From a recipient, like, what do we need to care about to make sure we cross our T's and dot our I's perspective? The HMIS data matters to your CAPER, which is your annual report to HUD, for your reimbursement requests, for your funding competitions, really, because your HMIS data plays a role in all sorts of other funding sources. It plays into your con plan, your consolidated plan, and your annual action plans. Both of them take HMIS data, and the HMIS, every single time you put together a con plan or an AAP, HMIS is the first place you're going to look for data. And if you've got crappy data in your HMIS, you're going to have lousy data in your con plan and your AAP. Your federal partner programs are going to care because they have similar required program reporting to the CAPER. And we're talking about all those programs that Mike mentioned earlier, SSVF through the Veterans Affairs, HOPWA through Department of Health and Human Services, RI through the Family, Youth and Services Bureau, or FISB, and so on and so on. All of these are programs that are designed to serve people experiencing homelessness, mostly within a specific subsection demographic that is of interest to the funder. Finally, it's about reporting out to your other stakeholders. This came into really clear focus in my last 2 years with Louisiana, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, and I started getting calls from the governor saying, we really need some information about what's going on with people experiencing homelessness. And if we had had data that I was not confident in our HMIS, I would have had to say to the governor of Louisiana, I got nothing. And this was on a call with cabinet secretaries. The worst position in the world is to be in one where your boss's 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 boss, who is on your television sometime, would like data that you could theoretically produce, and your data quality is not good, which is why it's incredibly important to have good HMIS data, and so that you can both demonstrate what you're doing and back up the decisions that you're making. And it's not just reporting up to the governor, it's reporters who are interested in homelessness, it's your local community organizations and your aldermen, and it's everybody else outside the immediate sphere of homeless services who might for some reason take an interest in homelessness. Having good data means having a good story, means being able to talk not just intelligently, but capably and reassuringly about the things that you are invested in. Also good for custom reporting. We love custom reporting. For example, custom reporting is how many people in a given county are experiencing homelessness and have at least one shot of a COVID-19 vaccine. That's a great custom report. Can't do it without good HMIS data, just not possible. Next slide, please. So the CAPER reporting process, this is your annual reporting process to HUD. This really only describes one part of the CAPER reporting process, how aggregate numbers of people who are served by ESG are reported to HUD on an annual basis. But the flow of it basically is that the CAHCD, the recipient, sets up funded projects in the SAGE HMIS reporting repository, which is just referred to as SAGE, which is an online portal that can be used for a lot of different things. We're going to show you a couple of cool things in a second. The recipient will email links from SAGE to subrecipients or subrecipients to gather data from them. The subrecipient or the sub pulls the CAPER report CSV. A CSV file, for those of you who don't know, in the event that you don't, is basically an Excel file. It's a data file. Pulls the CAPER report CSV out of HMIS and uploads it into SAGE using the relevant email link. So ultimately, HCD's responsibility is to set up the CAPER reporting box in SAGE, and then subrecipients and subrecipients put their data into that box. There's a note at the bottom of this slide. It's actually quite important. Corrections to CAPER reporting data have to be made directly in the HMIS client records. You can't mess around with the data in the CSV file. The reason is you're doctoring the data if you produce data from HMIS. And so think about it from the perspective of what you produce from HMIS represents what's actually happening. If you mess around with it downstream, first of all, you're telling a different story than your data actually tells, right? So you're messing around with your reporting. But also, if there's a problem, you haven't actually fixed it. What you've done is you've doctored the data so it looks fixed. So got to fix it in HMIS. Next slide, please.
There was one note that Chris put that I'm going to add. He noted that this is handled by Francisco, who's not a direct part of the ESG team. So just wanted to point out that, if there are questions about how this happens in-house, he just noted that this was handled by Francisco.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So this, again, if you see special note and VSP in the same slide, you can tell I usually had a hand in it. So special note about victim service providers. Again, they're prohibited from entering data into HMIS, but they are required to use an HMIS comparable database. Comparable databases must be able to produce a CAPER CSV to the same data for uploading into SAGE during the CAPER process. They have to be able to produce the same kind of CSV in the same way that the regular HMIS does. If a service VSP can't do that, then they're out of compliance with the HUD regulations around HMIS. And when that happens, you as the recipient have to work with a VSP to figure out a written plan for coming into compliance, which has to be approved by the field office and HUD headquarters. Not really a situation that you would like to be in. And ultimately, once everybody is on board, they can issue an exception template that will allow for manual data entry. But God, that's a long and painful process. The upshot here is, this was really only intended to be a one-time fix. It's used much more frequently than that. It's a blank CSV file that you just plonk data into. It's not good for all of the reasons that I just outlined, right? It's not really your community's data, it's what you're plonking in. It doesn't fix an upstream problem, it just gives HUD data. This is a good reason to get your HMIS comparable straight upstream rather than fixing it downstream. Next slide, please. So Stella is a visualization tool, Stella P. It's created by HUD. It uses household level data from the LSA, the Longitudinal Systems Analysis report, which COCs submit annually. It only includes HMIS data, but it can produce very cool looking data. It's a little hard to see on the screen because it's a little small, but what this is it's called a Sankey diagram, which represents flow through a system, much like water through a system of pipes. And so what this is showing is flow through the homeless services system. On the left, it starts with people who are served at all, how they're served, how they flow through the system, and then exits to permanent housing and returns to homelessness. It's an incredibly good diagram. I once had a staff person spend a year developing kind of a crummy version of this because it was such important data. And this is just one of the things that you can do with HMIS data. Next slide, please. Again, another sort of Stella report. This is about exits from the homeless response system to permanent, temporary, and unknown destinations. It's broken into different pathways, like emergency shelter or safe haven, or shelter and safe haven plus rapid. And this is really about helping COCs and the recipient, of course, identify points in the homeless response system that need additional scrutiny to serve people better. Janice, I see the question. We will get it at the end, I promise. Next page, please. Finally, this is still me. So ultimately, data from HMIS, and there are other sources, but primarily HMIS, filters up into the annual homeless assessment report to Congress, or AHAR, which is one of the sort of two primary ways that legislators get a hold of data about homelessness. The other one is the LSA, and it has significant repercussions on the way funding is allocated and the way at a national level our lawmakers look at homelessness response at every level of the country. Next slide, please. So action steps. What can you do with HMIS data? At the project level, it helps you assess project performance. It informs funding allocations, because project good, fund more, project bad, fund less, project struggling, do something with that. And it helps you collaborate with COCs, because ultimately you want to collaborate with your continuum of care partners when you're assessing ESG projects. From a monitoring perspective, it helps you assess risk, both is the HMIS data quality there, but also is this project performing well? It allows you to identify client files for review, and it's part of how you can do spot checks as part of reimbursements. Finally, from the reporting angle, as we said, it's required for the CAPER, and you need it for that. COC HMIS leads can provide custom reporting. Again, a really good local or a really good proximate example is vaccination rates. And finally, you can use it for statewide reporting, and should. Many communities do, and it's an incredibly powerful tool. Next slide, please. We've got some additional resources. We've referenced these throughout, so click them as you like them. And I think that takes us to Q&A, which I will hand back over to Mike.
Yep, I'm going to just take down the presentation so we can all see each other. And I believe we usually stop recording for this portion too, so let me take care of that.